I wanted to share this event that happened to me yesterday not only as a PSA about the dangers of meeting people online, but also how important it is to listen to your gut in situations like this. I'm a 20-year-old female, 5'3" and 120 pounds. Most people comment on how much younger I look than my age, which may be worth mentioning. I on and off use Tinder, usually just when I'm bored at night and want to kill time. I'm bi, mostly interested in girls, but I keep guys turned on in the Tinder settings because there aren't many girls on the app in my area. I matched with a guy who we'll call Adam, around the same age as me, and after Snapchatting for a few hours, I decided I was comfortable enough to meet up with him and smoke, although I should have realized how dumb of me it was to follow through with these plans. Since we both live with our parents, Adam said he knew a good spot for us to smoke privately without having to worry about other people or police, since smoking is not yet legal in my state. I was reluctant about meeting in a park to smoke with a stranger, but I was really bored and hadn't smoked in a few months. Adam sent me the address to the park and I headed that way. He sent me a snap showing me that he was in his car at the park waiting on me. He told me to come to the back of the park because we would be in a more secluded area, so I drove my car down the skinny path to the back parking lot where I saw a blue van parked in the corner. I started doubting my decision once he messaged me saying, "Hey, I'm in the blue van, come hop in." I kept looking at the van trying to make out any sign of a person in the driver's seat. To my surprise, not only did I see Adam in the front seat, but I saw another guy in the back of the van ducking his head. I immediately drove out of the park and blocked Adam on Snapchat and Tinder on the way out. A few minutes after pulling out and heading home, I got a notification on Snapchat indicating a guy named David had added me through search. Not through contacts or quick add, he literally searched my username. I didn't add him back, but he was still able to message me. I opened the message, which read, "You stupid wench." I guess it goes without saying that I blocked David as well. I'm not sure of the events that would have occurred had I entered the van, and quite frankly, I don't want to know. The internet can bring amazing relationships and friendships, however, be aware that there are people out there who have only bad intentions with anyone willing to meet up with them. My husband, Michael, and I are in our early 30s. We have 2 toddlers. The couple I will talk about I'll call Liz, and her husband we'll call Klinger. Now let's dive into the story. I was scrolling through Facebook when I noticed a post on one of our local Talk of the Town groups. Liz posted saying that she wasn't from the area and wanted to know where everyone hangs out and says she wants to make friends. Me, being my outgoing self, I decided to comment saying, "I'll be your friend." I know, it was a very stupid idea on my part, and I let my overly trusting and friendly personality get the best of me. Liz and I started Facebook messaging and quickly realized we had a lot in common. Klinger and I had mutual Facebook friends, so that made me more inclined to meet up. I arranged for the 4 of us to get dinner and hang out. We had a good time and shared the same sense of humor. It turned into Liz and I hanging out weekly and Klinger inviting Mike to play pool every week. Mike was working a very demanding job that made it hard for him to have the time to hang out, and when he did have the time, he was too tired. Well, this made Klinger turn a bit crazy. Klinger asked if Mike could go to a pool night, and he said no because of work. Klinger completely freaked out. He started texting Mike saying that he was being a part-time friend, and that he couldn't deal with having a friend that didn't give enough effort. He said that Mike was leading him on as a friend. Naturally, Mike and I thought, WTF? What is wrong with this guy? Mike started saying that Klinger was overreacting and that he has obligations like work and family time. He said that he doesn't have to be Klinger's friend and chill out. Mike ignored all messages from Klinger and we went about our days. Liz and I still hung out regularly, just us girls, and figured that Mike and Klinger didn't have to hang out with us. I thought, okay, problem solved. Wrong. Klinger started messaging me saying that he doesn't understand why Mike wouldn't want to hang out with him and that he wasn't being nice. I tried explaining that he's got a lot going on and to chill out. This just made him angry, and he lashed out by saying that Mike didn't give me enough me time and that everyone deserves that. He insisted that Mike take time for himself and have a guys' night weekly. I told Klinger that him and Mike don't have to be friends and it's not a big deal. You would think I would have cut Liz and Klinger out of my life right then, but I thought that I could be friends with only Liz. I then started to notice that Liz was becoming too clingy and would get mad if I said I felt like just hanging out at home instead of with her. She made me feel guilty for wanting to have time alone, so my idiot self fell for it and thought that it would be wrong of me to leave her to be lonely as she didn't have anyone in the area. This in turn made me spend more money than we could afford, as she always wanted to get drinks or food. Mike and I started arguing because Liz would twist things I said to her, then Klinger would spit them out to Mike. I thought about ending our friendship, but wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. This all changed when I got a text from Liz asking if Mike and I would want to come over and do Molly with them. I'm not into drugs, except maybe smoking occasionally, so I definitely wasn't about to go over to their place to do Molly. I said that we wouldn't, and I'm not into that. Anyways, plus we didn't have a sitter. Liz had the audacity to say that I should bring our kids over with us and their kids could play with them. I told her absolutely not, and she got mad that I said it was a bad idea. Meanwhile, Klinger is nonstop texting Mike saying that he's just some alcoholic and that he doesn't give it to me enough. Mike and I were totally taken aback as this came out of nowhere, and I never complained about my intimacy to Liz or Klinger. In fact, I told Liz that I was pretty content with that. I did mention Mike drinking a lot at the time, but didn't go into further detail, and it wasn't some big secret. He had a drinking problem around this time, but that's a story for another time. Klinger then lectured Mike about him needing to quit drinking and that he's just a terrible father just like his dad. My husband has his share of issues, sure, but he's not just some terrible dad and has dramatically improved since this occurred. Klinger then said that our kids are annoying and ugly. He told Mike that our son shouldn't have a pacifier and how we are intentionally screwing up his teeth. Keep in mind that they were around 17 months and 3 years old with standard tantrums. Mike said that he was done with the conversation and that there was no reason for him to disrespect our family, which obviously included a few choice words. Mike said he doesn't care what he's into, but that Klinger seems to be looking for a boyfriend, not a friend, and he's not into men. Klinger lost his mind and told Mike that he would break him in half. Mike blocked him on everything. Then I texted Liz saying that our friendship was over due to her psycho husband. After we blocked them, we didn't hear from them again, but I was nervous for a good month that Klinger would show up at our house and try to do something. It didn't help knowing that Klinger regularly went to the dark web and hearing all the horror stories surrounding that. Also, at the time, they lived about 10 minutes away. Thankfully, I knew beforehand that they would be moving to a city about 40 minutes away in the near future, so I knew it would be unlikely that I would run into them. So long story short, I learned the hard way that when it comes to friends, it's quality, not the quantity of friendships. We have a couple of good friends and are more than happy keeping it that way. So for Christmas, my family and I, including some family friends and their son, who is a good friend of mine, went to stay at a hotel near a ski center because we wanted to see some snow after a good 2 years of not seeing snow, because we live in Greece and it's pretty much extremely hot through the whole year. Now, when we arrived, we were told by our parents that me and my friend were going to stay at a hotel, and our parents were all going to stay together in a house a few minutes from where the hotel was. This didn't seem to bother us as we felt more free and quiet. Also, there was no other rooms for us left in the house with our parents. So everything was normal. We checked in the hotel and received the keys for our room. The whole place was pretty small and it had 3 entrances, one being to the cafeteria, which was a big door which was pretty much locked the whole time and was only opened by the staff during the morning in order for people staying at the hotel to have breakfast there. There was another entrance, which was the main entrance, and the doors were never locked, even at night. And lastly, there was a little back door which was pretty much open the whole time and had direct entrance to all the rooms that the guests stayed at. Moreover, I'll have to mention that you couldn't really lock the door of the room you stayed in because the doorknobs were messed up. So even if you had locked the door with a key, if you used enough force and you pushed the door, you could still open it. We stayed in room number 3, which was on the first floor, and was just one of the rooms in this really small hallway on the first floor. Now, the first 2 nights sleeping there didn't exactly feel comfortable, as of course we weren't sleeping in our houses, so we had to kind of adapt, but overall the hotel was pretty okay, and we didn't really feel unsafe since there were other people sleeping there too, and our parents' house was only about 5 minutes away. However, during the 3rd night, I couldn't really sleep, and about 5 in the morning I felt pretty uncomfortable as I had this gut feeling of having to protect my friend, since I've known him for a really long time, and I've always cared for him and kind of acted like a big brother to him. Therefore, I took my phone and turned on the flashlight as I looked around the room, and I didn't notice anything at first, so I just went to the bathroom really quick, and when I came out, I noticed 2 things. The first is that my friend had also woken up, and he was also kind of anxious, and he told me that he couldn't sleep. And the second is that there were some little mistletoe twigs spread around in the room. Now, I've noticed from the first day that the staff of the hotel had to hang mistletoe in the doorknobs of every room because it was Christmas. But I had never noticed our room being such a mess from the mistletoe before, despite one time where I had forced the doorknob open because my friend was sleeping inside the room and I had left the keys inside so I couldn't get in normally. That kind of shook me at first, but I tried to remain calm, and I just turned on the lights and started to talk to my friend about why he was also feeling anxious and at unease. He told me that he just couldn't sleep, and then he asked me something that creeps me out to this day. He asked me if I had stood up in the middle of the night and just looked down at him for a good 5 seconds before exiting the room for whatever reason so late. I didn't want to cause him any panic, so I just said, "Are you sure you didn't see that in your sleep? Because I never did that," and then proceeded to try to calm him down. Eventually, I did get him to calm down and got back to sleep, and I just put a chair close to the door and sat there on my phone till it became day, and some light started showing through the curtains. I never mentioned anything because I didn't want to cause anyone to panic, because this could have just really been a very unfortunate combination of events. Also, we were scheduled to leave that morning either way, so I just held all this inside myself and didn't tell anyone, but who knows what could have happened if, when I opened my phone flashlight, someone was actually there. I wrote here once before about a terrible experience in Chicago, but I think that moment of fear in the big city was dethroned by an event that happened yesterday. I want to preface this by saying thankfully it was a misunderstanding and there was actually no danger, but this just shows how even if you think you'll never be involved in something like this, that you're immune, you're very wrong. I used to think that way. It only happened yesterday, so it's pretty fresh in my memory still. I was with my friend and her husband, and we had just stepped into the mall after having our nails done. We had just exited the store we parked in front of and into the hallway. Immediately, we see people looking very unsettled. There were even a few people that were walking very hurriedly away and back to the exit. We stood there a little confused about what was happening. Although I didn't see it, my friend did. There were 2 people in a big fight. I'm talking like slamming the other down on the ground, WWE style. It seemed like we stood there confused for an hour, but it was only a few seconds before we heard someone say, "Gun." That's when people panicked. It was like a movie was playing out as I just stood there like, is this really happening? A woman rushed past me with a little girl in her arms, obviously wrapping her body around the child as if to protect her. Needless to say, we Usain bolted out of there. It was loud, the yelling and the people stampeding around us. I was just waiting for bullets to be flying through the air at all of this. My friend's husband had stopped at one point, and I could just hear my friend screaming his name. I slowed down a bit so I didn't lose her, but I also didn't want to be shot. I'm a little guilty about how my body just wanted to save itself, but my brain was telling me to stop and wait for her. I slowed my running and called her name, and thankfully both her and her husband were behind me again. We finally got back to the car, very out of breath since we hadn't ran like that since high school. We stood there by our vehicle for a while debating what we were going to do, and settled on getting drinks at a restaurant across the mall parking lot so he could watch what was going on since the police had just arrived by then. Suddenly my friend's husband looked at us all serious and said, "Go." And we get nervous all over again, and we're like, why? And he just keeps saying, "Go, go, go," and starts ushering us up hurriedly away. We finally got an answer to why he was rushing us away, and he said, either someone dropped something, or there was a gunshot. It didn't take long for people to figure out it was a miscommunication. We watched the police leave, and the mall reopened just fine in the hour or so we were at the bar and the restaurant. Looking at news articles about the event, the pop that my friend's husband had heard, and apparently many others had heard and thought it was also a gunshot, was someone's car rolling over a pop bottle that had burst and made a similar sound to a gun. All in all, thankfully nobody got hurt, aside from those guys inside who were fighting like they were in a boxing ring, and we still don't know who or why someone said gun. I never really thought something like this would happen to me, but obviously it can. You always just think you'll be safe, and just hear whatever happens on the news and say, wow, so glad I wasn't there. I'm from Latvia and lived in a very small town for 15 years until my mom moved to the UK. The town was so small that we only had 3 stores which were placed just a few meters away from each other. So rumors in there spread like forest fire, and everyone knew all the dirt about anyone. Max always seemed to have this kind of reputation of being a kid with a bit of mental issues, plus his mother was hardcore alcoholic, and father of course not present, instead ever-changing stepdads, one worse than the other. I kind of had sympathy with her because my mom had raised me and my twin brother while my dad was either laying drunk in some terrible apartment or when sober whining about how he feels like his heart will stop soon and he needs medication. I roll my eyes at the thought. Because my town was so small, I went to primary school with all my classmates, and Max was already showing antisocial behavior, throwing tantrums, stealing from other kids, pushing, etc. He even ended up throwing big wooden dice at another boy, which led him to have a crack right between his eyebrow. He still has a scar there. I've even seen it on Instagram. I don't remember the reason he got so mad, though. And somewhere around 12, we kind of became friends. As I also had label of weird kid too, because till 15, I would do this weird thing where I would spin pens and pencils on the floor while daydreaming about my imaginary world for hours. My parents thought I had some form of autism because of that. It turns out it was a coping mechanism because I was a black sheep in my family and had problems connecting with my friends, which made me cling onto him hard. He secured his position as good friend by love bombing. Although this term is used for a relationship, I just couldn't find a better word to describe it. Basically, it's like the honeymoon phase before the true colors come out. Then manipulation began at first, something small like, snatch some cigarettes from your granddad. Then it escalated to, if I would get a new toy or some sort of cool gift from my parents, he would ask to play with it, but then I wouldn't see it for days because he would pretend like he accidentally put it in his pocket and forgot to give it back. If I called him out, he would bring up the fact that his family is poor, telling me stuff about how privileged I am, and that people like me should starve for a week to know the true struggle. But the thing I hated the most was the, it's just a joke. Whatever he would do, something that made me terrified, like throwing lit matches at me while saying, "I'll burn you alive." It was some kind of hilarious joke, or pulling me down when we had PE in a pool, and if you ever were fortunate enough to experience drowning, you know what a scary experience it is. Thank God the coach banned him from practice. He also was the first person who I came out to. In Latvia, homophobia is pretty much normal, and it's hard to find anyone who is LGBT supporter, so it was a big deal for me. So he thought it's alright to try to pressure me into giving him certain sensual favors. Now keep in mind, at that age, I had no concept of what any of that was. I legitimately thought that babies just kind of came out of nowhere. Although I had enough courage to say no. And after that incident, he would gaslight me into thinking that I made this all up whenever I would bring it up. Also, he would get angry at me. He would call me the Russian F word. The frog incident was the last straw. We had this small forest in my town which was considered a tourist attraction. There was a shallow pit in the forest where people, mainly alcoholics and hobos, would throw all sorts of junk. We found an empty fish tank and a bottle with oil. He told me to hold the fish tank, so I did. Before I go further, I just wanted to say that I'm deeply ashamed of my actions. He placed the toad into the tank and proceeded to fill the tank with oil. The gravity of the situation hit me hard at this moment. Seeing this poor creature trying to make its way to the top while miserably failing, the thick black liquid dripping through its eyes made me cringe as I imagined how it would feel like if I was the one inside the fish tank. I remember after that I couldn't eat any wet food for weeks as it would remind me of that frog. I also remember my mom comforting me because I was nonstop crying, but not being able to explain why because of how guilty I felt. After that, I slowly was distracting myself from him, and then I moved to England, so he was pretty much a ghost of the past now. Although I still struggle mentally as I recently was diagnosed with BPD, which might explain why I tolerated him for so long, at least I learned to cut toxic people after the first red flag. I know most of us believe in ghosts. The question is, have you seen one? For years I've watched ghost shows like Ghost Adventures, but I never thought I'd see one. I've always just explained away bumps in the night. But here's two stories that, to me, still send shivers up my spine. Back in 2013, I had just turned 19, living in a super small town in Alberta, Canada. That year, the river surrounding the town flooded. Homes were lost as well as lives in surrounding communities. I believe this is what made the energy in these homes stronger. At the time, I was living with my boyfriend's family in a very old home, estimated about 112 years old at the time. It was just a small, typical farmhouse, moved into town from an unknown farm in Alberta. It was a 2-bedroom, 1-bath with a new add-on basement with 2 other bedrooms. Picture an old farmhouse, the original hardwood floors, white crown moldings, very tight hallways and small rooms. Me and my boyfriend's room was in the add-on basement. It was always freezing and very, very dark. And before I moved in, his mom used to witness a dark figure standing outside the house, just staring in through the windows at night. Whatever this thing was would bang on the doors and exterior walls. Now, when anyone new would move in, that figure would then come into the house too. New neighbors moved in next door, and things started getting strange. Every day when everyone would get home from work, things would be moved around and rummaged through, but nothing would be taken, so we assumed the neighbors were coming in the house. One day, me and my boyfriend got home before anyone else, and like normal, things were moved around. So we cleansed everything else and went downstairs to relax before bed. His family had 3 dogs at the time, and you could hear them walking around upstairs. We finally get ready for bed and lay down. All of a sudden, we hear someone run around upstairs. Not the dogs walking around, but a person stomping. But none of the dogs were barking or getting upset. No one else was going to be home till about 11 p.m. or later. We call his mom asking if she had gotten home, and the answer was no. So my boyfriend jumps out of bed and grabs his shotgun, thinking someone had broken into the house. He sweeps the house room to room, and nothing. No one but the dogs and us were there. As soon as we get back, we lay down after finding out no one was there. Whatever had walked through the house before runs out. One day, I was staying at my boyfriend's sister's house for the night. This home she owns is very haunted. Her daughters talk to a person named Ogie. Screaming and yelling, this thing is scarring them. Their motion-censored toys go off all the time, and so on. Anyways, this night I was just falling asleep on the couch, and out of the corner of my eye, something keeps moving in the kitchen, next to the living room. All of a sudden, in the middle of the night, I wake up to a chill running down my spine. I go to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. As I walk into the kitchen, the overhead light flicks on, and I turn to tell the kids it's late and time for bed. But instead, I see a woman in a white dress. Her body was deformed. Her long dark hair was covering her face. Think the girl from The Grudge hair. Then, as soon as the light flicked on, it goes off and she's gone. This house is built next to an old unmarked graveyard. All of the family has seen this woman walking through the house and the yard. I think it's evil as the kids are so scared of it and says she does mean things to them and lives on the ceiling. Needless to say, those homes scare me and everyone who lives in them. Now, are ghosts real? Well, now I know. They are. This took place a few years ago in a little English town. Me and my friends had been out in the town. I think we may have been to see a movie or something. Either way, we were walking back to my friend's house, a walk I had walked many times before when we got to this church. We were being rowdy and having a good time when all of a sudden we heard a gut-wrenching scream. At first we thought it was coming from across the road where an abandoned building was. The screams continued, and after a few seconds we realized that they were coming from behind us in the church. We thought that it could possibly be a few kids messing around, but either way our curiosity got the better of us. We walked into the yard to try and pin down the location of the screams. It's safe to say at this point we were freaked. The screams honestly sounded like someone was dying. I got out my phone at this point and called the police. All the while the screams were continuing, getting louder the closer we approached the church. The police were asking for our location, what we were hearing, trying to keep us calm. My friends were losing it. It was then that the lights of the church illuminated the graveyard. We ducked to avoid the lights hiding behind headstones. Then, just as suddenly as they came on, they went off again. Then on, then off, then on and off once more. At that point, we hightailed it out of there. We weren't sticking around to find out what was going on. The police called me back a few minutes later when we were further down the road. They said that they arrived at the church and looked around, however they couldn't see or hear anything. I asked whether the lights were on or any of the doors were unlocked, but they said that the entire property was fully sealed and no lights were on. To this day, I have no idea what took place that night. In all honesty, I had forgotten about it until my friend had reminded me. We all kind of wrote it off as a weird experience, but there was something about those screams that still, even to this very day, make me feel uneasy. This is a true story that really happened to me back in 2006 when I was living in Hobie Sound Beach, Florida, a rather small town in between some bigger beach towns. I had just driven back home to Oklahoma to visit and happened to talk to one of my best friends, Joe, into moving back to Florida with me. One night, Joe and I had decided we were going to head down to the beach, bring a couple of beers and some herb, and chill out down by the ocean. It was a nice night. As we pulled up, I remember parking my car in the beachside parking lot. We were listening to Sublime and opening our first beers when I told Joe I was going to go walk down to the beach. I kicked off my sandals and walked down to the ocean. The ocean was flat, waves barely rolling up against my ankles. As I'm standing there gazing upon the open ocean, I hear Joe say something as he started walking down from the car towards me on the beach. Then what I can only describe as an ethereal blue lane of light illuminates me. The light creates a lane about 15 feet wide. The light illuminated the sand from the ocean to the top of the beach's sand dune. What struck me as odd was that it wasn't a broadcast light in a V shape from the origin. It was a parallel lane of light. It was illuminating the granules of sand in a way I've never seen light do before. As it lit me up, I exclaimed to Joe, "What is that?" I began to search for the origin of the light. I didn't see nor hear anything in the sky above, so I focused my attention on the ocean. I could somehow sense that this light was coming from near offshore. I squinted to look for any stern lights, assuming maybe this was coming from a boat. This was a clear night, and in a clear night off the Florida coast, you can see a boat's light for miles off the coast into the horizon. I saw nothing. No boats, no shadow outlines along the horizon, nothing. Still, I could sense that this light illuminating me was coming from a few hundred yards off the beach, albeit still unable to physically see the object. This analysis all happened within a matter of probably 20 to 30 seconds as the light illuminated me. The light then slowly dissipated off me. It then lit up Joe's lane for about 10 seconds, who had now descended the top of the beach and was almost closing in on me. Now he's freaking out. Then the light dissipates off him and illuminated the lane on the other side of me, where there was nothing. The light then behaved in a wave I will never forget. It did a rapid shuffle off the 3 lanes in a random fashion. It straight up scanned us, is all I can describe it as. The next thing I know, a huge tidal wave is picking me up off the beach. The wave had to have been 20 foot tall. It picked me up off the ground and threw me face first into the beach like a rag doll. If you've ever skateboarded, I'm sure you've heard the term scorpioned, where you eat it face first and then your legs wrap up over your head from behind you. Worst case scenario kind of ordeal, that's what happened. Not so gnarly. As I got up, I yelled for Joe. I heard him. He had been washed about 30 yards inland. I walked up to him and said, "Dude, are you okay? What was that?" He said in a quiver, I don't know, man." Just then I felt this really creepy, spooky sixth sense feeling come over me, like we'd just seen a ghost. He'd felt it too. It was written all over both of our faces. I said, "Let's get out of here right now." So we jumped back into my car and hauled it back to the house. As we're sitting on the couch in the living room trying to recount what had just happened on the couch, we must have been talking very loud. My cousin, who had been in bed sleeping, comes out and says, "Guys, it's 4:30 in the effing morning. What are you guys out here yelling about? I gotta wake up for work in like an hour." He was so mad. Simultaneously, we both started blurting out what had to have seemed like absolutely insane retelling of what just happened. He didn't believe us, of course. He asked us if we had taken hard drugs or were drunk. We weren't. We'd only both had 1 beer each. Then as he goes back to his room to go to sleep, I looked over to my friend Joe and said, "Wait, 4:30? We went out there at like 11 and I've only been gone an hour." We both looked at each other with frightened eyes. The next day I woke up and had a burn mark around my right eye socket from where the force of the impact on the beach had literally sandpapered what resembled road rash on my face. I've told myself many things over the years to try to make sense of it. Government helicopters, submarines, tidal wave warning systems, but deep in my gut I know that Joe and I will never forget, and coincidentally also never fully remember, the time we were possibly abducted by an unidentified submerged object. I was 20 years old back then, just a pup. I recuperated fast, but the older I got, closer to my 30s, the worse and worse my back showed I wasn't all right. That tidal wave that scorpioned me up onto the beach really had messed me up. I have to use a back roller and a back massager daily to do physical rehab on myself for what feels like 3 to 4 completely blown vertebrae. It's literally a daily reminder that whatever happened out there on the beach that night in Florida really did happen. I'd like to start this by saying I am a skeptic. As a child, my father always gave my brother and I a choice to be whatever we wanted to be, thus giving me the option to think critically and look at the world from the most logically explainable standpoint. So this is all just as confusing to me now as it was when I was witnessing it as a child or teenager. My parents weren't around very much when I was a kid. My dad working day and night as an aerospace engineer at U of M, and my mother simply wanted nothing to do with me. So my brother and I spent a lot of time with our grandfather, and the house we stayed at was a big Victorian-style house. My grandma had a thing for antiques, and so the house was decorated that way. During the strange times of living in that house, my grandparents were separated. My grandma was living in North Carolina for more than 8 years, leaving my grandpa to take care of said big empty house. I always loved staying there as a kid because I practically had no bedtime, and I got to spend most of Friday through Sunday watching anime and eating whatever I wanted whenever I wanted. I was a pretty isolated kid, and it was the perfect distraction for someone like me who didn't have friends to hang out with. That being said, the very first time I ever saw her was on one of these nights. Another thing I neglected to mention is that my room there is full of dolls. If I recall correctly, my grandma has over 300 Barbies, all still in their boxes, a small little bunch of porcelain dolls, and this antique chair that had a bunch of Raggedy Anns all sitting on it. It never really bothered me, but my brother won't set foot in that room. I guess I'm just not one of those people who's scared of dolls. In the past, I'd had issues with that chair full of Raggedy Anns, particularly when I'd leave my room and come back and all of the dolls that I'd just stacked up nicely and by size from big to small were laying on the floor all of a sudden. I just assumed it was my grandma's cat using the chair to get up into the window, and maybe she just knocked them all over in the process, but it became more of an issue when it was happening even when I'd shoo the cat out, close my door, and wake up to all the Raggedy Anns on the floor again. It was about 2 in the morning on either Friday or Saturday, and I was starting to feel drowsy, so I shut off Toonami and went into my room. It seemed like a typical weekend for 12-year-old me, you know? I turned on my little nightlight, got into bed with a glass of water next to me, took off my glasses, then shut off the light. When I laid there, eyes shut, I could feel myself drifting off into sleep, listening to the silence of the house, only to be woken up by the sound of those dolls hitting the floor as they fell off the chair at the foot of my bed. I got this strange tingling sensation on the back of my neck, but due to my stubbornness, I kept reassuring myself that it was nothing. Maybe it was just one of the dolls being unbalanced and causing a dolly avalanche or whatever. I kept trying to sleep, focusing on the familiar noises of my surroundings in the dark. The sound of the grandfather clock out in the hallway ticking, my grandpa snoring in the other room, the occasional popping sounds of the old house settling. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary yet. I had the strangest gut feeling ever. So I sat up to get a sip of water in hopes of calming myself. When I sat my glass back down on the nightstand, I looked up from where I sat, only to meet eyes with a small child sitting in the chair across from my bed. She smiled at me, then looked back down at whatever she was doing. In my head, I'm trying to rationalize this like, oh, maybe she's a friend of the family. But no, that still wouldn't explain why she's sitting in my bedroom at 2 a.m. So I had to be dreaming, right? I went to take off my glasses to rub my eyes, only to remember that I had already taken my glasses off and they were sitting on the nightstand. I could see this person perfectly, even though everything else around her was blurry in the dim light of the nightlight. I rubbed my eyes almost frantically, thinking I had officially gone crazy or something, but when I looked back up to the chair, she was gone. I got no sleep that night and finally passed out when the sun was coming up, and I didn't tell a single soul about it until I was about 16, and the topic of the paranormal came up at breakfast one day. My brother, Grandma, and I were all sat at the table chatting after eating, and my grandma brought up that the house was haunted. She's very superstitious. And my brother mentioned being in the kitchen a few months ago and seeing the little girl standing at the top of the stairs when he looked over from where he stood. I'll tell you, when he told me that, I nearly soiled myself because I'd been bottling what I saw up for years, and I immediately spilled the beans to him about it. Just the fact that we both saw the same girl during very different time periods freaks me out for some reason, but the thing is, things got worse after that. During my teens, things got rough for my family. Things were not good at home. My mom was caught cheating on my dad, my brother left and no one knew where he went, and I was in a very deep depression. My grandpa had finally made the decision to move down to North Carolina to be with my grandma, and their house here in Michigan sat empty for years. If that house wasn't empty before, I'd start driving by then, so I'd take my little beater car over to their empty house and just sit in the formal living room on the ugly floral print couches in silence. I would go there as my escape place to cry about all the awful things going on in my life, and I would cry to the cat that had been left behind that I'd been feeding and caring for. It's like the house would almost soak up my emotions, and the only way I could describe it is like when you wring out a sponge into a bucket. My feelings being the soapy water trapped in the sponge and the house being the bucket. There was a day I'd gotten out of school and was upset, so I drove to that house and went into the old room and cried. When I was all out of tears, I started going through all of my antique wardrobes and dressers in search of my old ballet shoes, or really any other memories stowed away from when I was a kid. When I opened one of the smaller drawers and found a medical bracelet from the 70s with a name on it. The name read Casey. My middle name is Casey. I got out my phone and immediately called my mom about it. At the time, I wasn't really on speaking terms with my mother, so it was a bit of a rough phone call, but it was one that made me understand some things a little bit better. My mother had a little sister named Casey who died at a very young age. I guess when Casey was conceived, my grandmother had an IUD but got pregnant anyway. She decided to have the baby regardless of all the health issues that the baby would have. Casey died before she turned 3 due to related health complications, and during the autopsy, they found the IUD inside of her instead of my grandmother. Learning this information broke my heart, and while I understand why no one wanted to talk about it, it would have been nice to know that my middle name had that kind of significant meaning. After taking a bit to let all of this soak in, I decided to go back up to my old room and look for more of Casey's things. And the other thing I found was a picture of Casey. I sat on the floor looking at this photo for a long time. In the corner of my room was a full-body mirror, and I scooted closer to it and held the picture up. I thought I was the only person in my family to have red hair and blue eyes. My parents, grandparents, and brother all have brown hair and brown eyes, but I realized just how much I look like Casey. I looked myself in the eyes and began to cry, feeling overwhelmed with this somber realization that the reason my mom resented me so much was because I looked like her dead sister. I held the photo and bracelet close to me and whispered, "Casey, I'm so sorry. I wish we could have met." And when I closed my eyes, I felt this strange sensation on the top of my head that I can only describe as a kiss, and then the house felt empty. Like actually empty this time in a way that I had never felt before, as if the weight was gone. I didn't go back there for a long time. Things went back to normal, though my version of normal at the time was not normal at all, but those stories are for a different time. I spent more time at home putting up with my family until the next year. My grandparents started talking about selling their house in Michigan and just living in North Carolina instead. It was around fall of the next year that I finally went back to that house again. I don't recall exactly what I had gotten into a fight with my mom about that time, but I was angry enough to pack a backpack up and leave. When I walked into the foyer, I noticed a lot of things that had already been in disrepair before my grandparents left had now turned into full-on decay. The paint on the walls had begun chipping off like brittle eggshells, and the house now smelled like mothballs and black mold as the basement had begun to leak regularly. The cupboards had bugs and mice scurrying about them, and some of the trees in the backyard had fallen dangerously close to the house. When I walked into my old room, it was like nothing had changed from when I was a kid, though. It was like a little time capsule of dolls, doilies, and lace curtains. I could feel it, though. She was gone. It was colder in there. I set down my bag next to the bed, and I remember taking off my shoes and just sitting. Not really doing anything, just sitting in silence for a long time. The grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped since no one was here to wind it back up. I knew that I probably shouldn't sleep in this empty house, but everything else going on in my life was kind of horrible, and I thought that at least here I wouldn't have to face the wrath of my mother's abuse. The thing is, I thought very wrong. It was a mistake sleeping there. If there was something I could change, it would be this event, because even now, 7 years later, I'm still traumatized by what happened. I put some pajama pants on and turned on my nightlight, which at that point was on its last leg. I mean, the thing flickered on and off if you even lightly brushed against it, but I didn't care. I just wanted to feel that sense of nostalgia and belonging again. It was all I had to keep me going, because I felt like I had literally no one. When I climbed into bed, the sheets were musty and the metal bed frame creaked every time I moved, but I managed to shut off the lights and go to sleep for a little bit. Then I woke up. I couldn't move. My body was numb and it was dark except for the small nightlight. I didn't know what sleep paralysis was before that, so I had no idea what was happening. I started to panic when I looked down at the end of the bed to see this black figure with its white eyes peeking at me from the end of the bed. It was crouched in front of the bed, hands rested on the edge on either sides of my feet. I couldn't make out the outline of its stick-like fingers against the white comforter. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was forced to watch as this sickly, skinny creature slowly draped its long arms over my feet and grabbed them, pulling them ever so slightly. I began hyperventilating. Once it was on the bed, it crawled over to me, making these fast, jerky movements, its joints crackling and popping with every action. If it had a mouth, I couldn't see it, but as it creeped closer to my face, all I could hear was its raspy breathing accompanied with coughing and cackling on me. Its breath nearly made me vomit, but that's what shook me out of the sleep paralysis, and I jerked awake only to be met with an empty room, an empty house. Nothing was here but me. Needless to say, I left and I haven't been back there since. I kinda hope they tear down that house. Like I said, I'm a skeptic, but even I have to admit that there's something really messed up about that house. Falling down, falling down, falling down. The incessant sound of my toddler came from the back seat as we made our way to the park. "Cassie, keep it down back there. I can hardly hear myself think." My daughter Cassandra was really finding her voice lately and was no stranger to repeating random things loudly and as much as possible. Anyone familiar with the terrible twos in the years directly following will understand that struggle. It was hard to find my peace at times, but my wife and I did our best and always made things work. Our date nights are few and far between, but when we finally got around to them, they were always just what the doc ordered. It has been a while since our last one, and I'm starting to think it's time to call up Cassie's grandpa before long for another. It was my wife's night to go see her friends, and I was on babysitting duty. Nothing better than a trip to the park to wear out a kid with all that pent-up energy. This way, she will run rampant for 30 minutes to an hour and be worn out by the time we're driving home. That, of course, leads to her falling asleep in her car seat and an easy transfer to the bed once we arrive. As you can tell, I've kind of got this thing down to a science. Cassie was very particular in which parks she liked to play at. Strange, I know. Her favorite was the one downtown with the stone chairs that you could talk to each other in front of from really far away. Something to do with the concave shape of them and how they are positioned to bounce the sound around. There was plenty else to do there as well, but that part was always her favorite. We made it to the bridge heading into town, and Cassie started to really wig out. She kept calling out, "Dad! Daddy! Help!" I was afraid that something was terribly wrong with her, so I pulled over just after the bridge into a nearby parking lot in front of a pizzeria. I unbuckled her as quickly as I could and pulled her to the front seat with me to examine her. "What's wrong, sweetie? Tell Daddy what's wrong." Everything appeared to be fine with her besides the fact that she wouldn't stop crying. I just held on to her and let her cry it out. Kids can get like that sometimes, but I was just glad to find out that she wasn't hurt. "It's gonna be alright, Cassie. We're gonna go to the park, and we can even stop to get some ice cream on the way if you want." I wasn't against a little bribing if it meant I could have some peace and quiet. Not the best parenting technique, but sometimes it was necessary for your sanity. That's when I heard it. A sound that would change my life as well as the lives of so many others. A loud rumbling accompanied by the sounds of piercing screams. I turned toward the noise and saw the bridge crumbling, covered from front to back in rush hour traffic. There were a couple of people who had been walking that scrambled in a mad dash, but were not able to make it to safety. Some of the drivers had thrown their doors open in hopes of the same, but it all happened far too fast. Not one person from one end to the other was able to make it off the bridge before the total collapse. It was a day that nobody in the city would ever forget, and all that kept running through my head were the words of my daughter as she sat in the car seat on her way to cross the bridge. Falling down, falling down, falling down. Cassie was no stranger to occurrences such as this one. When she was too young to speak a word, she was already prone to these types of incidents. While at first glance they might only seem a bit weird, looking back now, I fear that they were premonitions which we were unable to understand. Her grandmother and my mother passed away due to a heart attack. The doctors said that if she had gotten to a hospital, it was more likely than not that she would have been able to pull through. The one thing that always stuck out to me about that day as far as Cassie was concerned, she had taken every block, every puzzle piece, and every toy that was shaped like a heart and placed it in the center of the room. If that wasn't strange enough, she had placed every one of them on top of her favorite pictures of her and her Nana from one of their many zoo trips that they had taken together. Much like this time with the bridge, Cassie had been completely inconsolable, although neither me nor my wife had the slightest clue what was wrong at the time. Another time that stands out was when we had brought Cassie to see the newest princess movie at the movie theaters. She had known very few words at this point, but she could manage to speak a select few from time to time. We had to leave early from the movie. Babies didn't tend to do well without for long periods of time without crying or being noisy in some type of fashion. When we walked past the last theater on our way out, though, Cassie began to say, "Fire! Fire, Daddy! Mommy! Fire!" It was wintertime, and we had been making fires at home every night, so we assured her that when we arrived at home, we would be sure to make a fire for her in the fireplace. Once we arrived, I threw a few logs on and worked my magic with the kindling, newspaper, and some heavy blowing before grabbing the remote to turn on the nightly news. To the surprise of my wife and I, the theater that we had just been at was on the news, and the flames were crackling as a black cloud of smoke rose from the side of the building. Apparently the theater we had just been walking by when Cassie began to go on about the fire had sparked in the flames during the showing that was going on just moments after. I could go on and on about the different times like this that just seemed a bit too strange to be coincidence. I really don't have the stomach for it now, though. You see, I've been pacing the bedroom with my stomach in knots for the past hour trying to figure out what this could mean or what I should do. It was only yesterday now that the tragic events happened with the bridge. As heartbreaking and earth-shattering as that was for me to witness, It was something that my sweet daughter Cassandra said to me today that has me in such a frenzy. She looked at me and said, "Please watch out for the scary man, Daddy." I don't think I'll be able to sleep a wink tonight. God help me. I may never be able to sleep again. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, /letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.